There are wounds that feel personal, and then there are wounds that feel ancient. Betrayal belongs to the second kind. It does not merely hurt your feelings. It breaks a private mythology. A person you trusted turns, a bond you believed in collapses, and suddenly the world you were standing on no longer feels solid. But the old initiatory traditions would say this moment is not only emotional, it is alchemical. It is the beginning of the black phase, the descent into inner night, when the false structure of the self starts to crack. Jung understood something similar. The psyche does not only suffer collapse, it uses collapse. It arranges certain shocks to expose what consciousness refuses to see. And this is the dangerous thought at the center of our journey. What if every outer betrayal awakens an inner betrayer? A hidden force in you that traded truth for comfort, instinct for approval, wholeness for the temporary safety of illusion. Tonight, we enter that chamber slowly, not to glorify pain, but to understand why treachery so often becomes the threshold of transformation. In an old coastal city once called Selene, there is a forgotten story about a manuscript keeper named Lucan. He was known for preserving rare spiritual texts, copying them by candlelight, sealing them in leather, and teaching young students how to handle sacred words with clean hands and disciplined attention. Among them was one student he trusted more than the others, a quiet young man named Oren, whose humility seemed almost devotional. Lucan opened his library, his methods, even his private commentaries to him. Then, one winter morning, Oren was gone. So were several pages from Lucan's most guarded notebook, along with a purse of silver left by a patron. The city called it theft. Lucan, at first, called it sacrilege. But what truly shattered him was not the loss of money, nor even the stolen pages. It was the humiliation of discovering that his wisdom still depended on being admired. The betrayal did not only reveal the student's character, it revealed the hidden bargain inside the teacher. He had mistaken reverence for truth and mentorship for inner solidity. This is why betrayal feels so strangely clean in its violence. It removes decoration. It strips the persona from the bone. In ordinary sorrow, you lose something. In betrayal, you also lose the story you were telling about yourself. Jung would say that such moments constellate the shadow, not only the darkness of the other person, but the neglected regions of your own psyche. The part that ignored what it knew. The part that preferred harmony over truth. The part that quietly sensed danger, but accepted the sweetness of illusion because it felt easier than standing alone. This is where the inner Judas first appears, not as evil in a theatrical sense, but as a function of self-betrayal. It is the impulse that sells a deeper integrity for smaller rewards, approval, certainty, belonging, the narcotic comfort of staying blind. And so the first alchemical operation begins. Not revenge, not moral performance. Extraction. What in you was purchased? What instinct was silenced? What warning did you translate into hope? Because hope was more flattering to your identity than reality. The old alchemists began with a substance they called prima materia, the raw, impure mass from which transformation begins. It was never beautiful. It was dense, contaminated, embarrassing. Psychologically, betrayal drags you straight into that substance. It forces into daylight what the polished self was trying to keep underground. Dependency, vanity, denial, hunger, fear. Most people answer this moment by searching for a villain, because villains simplify pain. They allow the ego to remain noble, while the other becomes darkness itself. But inner work begins the moment you realize the psyche is not a courtroom. It is a laboratory of transmutation. The figure of Judas in this sense is not merely a person in sacred history. It is an archetypal force that breaks false unions so that a more truthful wholeness can emerge. Sometimes that force arrives through another person's deceit. Sometimes it appears through your own relapse, your own compromise, your own repeated sale of tomorrow for the relief of tonight. Betrayal becomes initiation the moment you stop asking only, "Who harmed me?" and begin asking, "What illusion in me needed to die?" There is a Sufi tale, half history and half whisper, about a wandering teacher named Farid who kept a lantern burning outside his door every night. Travelers thought it was hospitality. His students thought it was a sign of spiritual vigilance. But the truth was more private. Farid feared the darkness in his own dwelling. One autumn, a soft-spoken guest arrived and asked for shelter. He bowed deeply, spoke gently, and listened with an almost reverent patience. Weeks passed. Then one dawn, the guest vanished, taking with him a small chest of letters, prayers, and reflections Farid had written over many years. Farid ran through the streets in a state of fury, crying out for justice. But when he returned home exhausted, he noticed something strange. The lantern outside had gone out during the chase, and in the darkness, for the first time, he saw a split in the inner wall where dampness had been spreading for years. The theft had not created the hidden damage. It had only removed the light he was using to avoid seeing it. That is the hidden psychology of betrayal. The betrayer does not always place darkness inside you. More often, they expose the darkness that was already waiting beneath your certainty. Jung warned that what remains unconscious does not vanish. It returns as fate. Betrayal is one of fate's sharpest languages because it pierces the ego where it feels most innocent. You believe that if you are sincere enough, loyal enough, careful enough, life will answer with safety. But the psyche is not built on transaction. It is built on initiation. In the black stage of alchemy, your ideals are dragged down into the soil to be tested. Was your kindness truly free? Or was it a strategy to avoid abandonment? Was your trust a form of openness or a refusal to see? Was your devotion love or a bargain made in secret with loneliness? These questions are humiliating, but they are sacred. Because once the illusion cracks, a deeper honesty can begin. And honesty in the inner life is always more valuable than innocence. This is the descent that so many traditions describe in different language, but with the same structure. The mystics call it the dark night. The alchemists call it NIGREDO. Jung would call it the collapse of a one-sided consciousness. Whatever the name, the experience is the same. You do not simply lose a person, you lose the map that told you who you were. And in that disorientation, the inner Judas appears more clearly. Not as a horned enemy, but as a mirror. It says, "Look where you betrayed your own instinct to preserve the image. Look where you dismissed red flags because the fantasy was warmer than the truth. Look where you abandoned your boundaries so the story could continue a little longer." This is why real transformation is never flattering at first. It begins with an encounter with your own participation. Not to erase the wrong done to you, but to reclaim the power you gave away. The alchemist does not run from this mirror. He seals it in the vessel and studies what it reveals. In Hermetic language, that vessel is the vas hermeticum, the sealed chamber where opposing forces are held together long enough for transformation to occur. Psychologically, it means something very practical. Learning to remain with the experience without turning it into immediate action. Betrayal tempts you into two false exits. The first is vengeance, which keeps your attention chained to the one who wounded you. The second is premature forgiveness, which often wears the mask of wisdom while hiding a fear of anger, conflict, and loss. Both are evasions. Both interrupt the work. The deeper discipline is conscious containment. You allow grief to speak, rage to speak, humiliation to speak, but you do not let any of them become your master. You listen as an alchemist listens to a boiling substance, trying to understand what element is rising to the surface. Because your strongest reaction is rarely meaningless. It is usually guarding something precious, a boundary you never honored, a dignity you abandoned, a power you buried so deeply that pain became the only force strong enough to uncover it. Now we enter the most dangerous corridor of all: projection. At first, the betrayer appears as pure darkness, a single shape onto which the psyche throws all blame, all disgust, all moral certainty. This is understandable. Pain wants simplicity. But Jung saw that projection is one of the ego's oldest defenses. It paints the other in absolute colors so you do not have to face the complexity inside yourself. The actions of the betrayer are still theirs. Their deception remains real. But the archetypal energy they activate in you may belong partly to what you have disowned. Perhaps they embody a selfishness you never allowed yourself, the ability to choose yourself without apology. Perhaps they carry a cunning intelligence you buried beneath niceness. Perhaps they represent a forbidden freedom, the courage to leave what no longer fits. This is why betrayal can become catalytic. It forces you to reclaim exiled qualities. The wound becomes a strange teacher, showing you not only what harmed you, but what power you abandoned in order to remain acceptable. In the old schools of alchemy, after blackening came separation, the patient work of dividing one substance from another. This is the stage betrayal demands from the soul. You separate fact from fantasy, event from interpretation, their choice from your lesson. Without this step, the wound becomes mythology, and mythology easily becomes prison. So the inner work turns almost forensic. What actually happened? What did I assume could never happen? What signs did I dismiss because they threatened the identity I wanted to preserve? There is an old story of a philosopher called Marin, who wore a bronze ring, said to protect him from deception. Students gathered around him, convinced his clarity came from the ring. Over time, he began to believe it too. One evening, after a public lecture, the ring vanished. He collapsed into panic, unable to think, as though wisdom itself had left his body. Only later did he discover the deeper humiliation. The ring had not held his insight together. It had merely concealed how frightened he was of uncertainty. That is the anatomy of betrayal at its most practical level. It removes the talisman, the relationship, the role, the habit, the image of being chosen. Whatever you used to steady yourself against inner emptiness is suddenly torn away. And what remains is not only grief, but enchantment. Your attention becomes bound to the wound. You replay the scene, imagine different endings, check for signs, rehearse speeches that will never be heard. The occult traditions understood something modern people forget. Attention is life force. Whatever captures it begins to shape your future. This is why Jung spoke of withdrawing libido, meaning psychic energy, from the object that has become overcharged with meaning. You do not reclaim yourself by denial. You reclaim yourself by discipline. Name the hook. Is it rage, shame, longing, humiliation, the fantasy of reversal? Then name the hidden payoff. What do you gain by remaining bound? Identity as the wounded one? Permission to avoid the next chapter? Once you see the payoff, the spell begins to weaken. This is where the whitening begins, what the alchemists called albedo. Not happiness, not spiritual optimism. Clarity, the clear water that rises only after the rot has been faced. In psychological terms, albedo often arrives as a cold and sober realization. I was loyal to an image, not a reality. I was attached to potential, not truth. I confused intensity with intimacy. I called familiarity destiny because uncertainty frightened me more than disappointment. This phase is humbling because it asks for participation, not performance. You must see where you helped sustain the illusion, not to accuse yourself, but to recover agency. Because as long as all power remains with the betrayer, your inner life stays impoverished. So new questions appear. Where did I trade discernment for belonging? Where did I silence my body's warnings to protect a narrative? Where did I fear solitude more than dishonesty? This is the clean sorrow of awakening. The past does not change, but your sight does. And sight is the beginning of freedom. But clarity alone is not enough. After albedo comes grief of a more intimate kind. Not only they betrayed me, but I betrayed myself by remaining where my soul was already withdrawing. This is the deeper wound, the self-abandonment that often precedes the outer rupture. Depth psychology returns to this pattern again and again. We repeat familiar pain because it is easier to interpret than freedom. We remain loyal to roles that keep the ego intact. The rescuer, the patient one, the endlessly understanding one, the person who can endure anything and still call it love. Betrayal shatters that role. And that is why it feels so annihilating. Without the role, you are forced to meet the raw question beneath it. Who am I when I stop performing goodness to earn security? The mystics knew this terror well. It is the death before renewal, the stripping away of false garments. Sacred suffering begins here, in quiet mourning, when you let the old self die without turning the funeral into another mask. In Hermetic symbolism, the stage after purification is conjunctio, the union of opposites, the alchemical marriage. This is where betrayal stops being only a wound and becomes a teacher of integration. At first, the psyche splits. One part of you hardens into suspicion. Another still aches for tenderness. One part wants to close every gate forever. Another still longs to trust, to love, to remain open to beauty. If you choose only one side, you become divided. Either innocence returns as blindness, or caution calcifies into bitterness. The deeper task is to hold both. To become soft without becoming foolish. To become discerning without becoming cold. Jung called this the transcendent function, the birth of a third position that can contain tension without collapsing into extremes. This is maturity in the alchemical sense. You can forgive without returning to the same altar. You can feel compassion without surrendering judgment. You can love, but now your love includes boundaries, and your boundaries no longer apologize for existing. And so we arrive at the red phase, rubedo, the embodiment of what the wound has taught. Because insight that does not alter behavior remains only beautiful language. The inner Judas is not conquered in theory. It is met in daily life, in the small negotiations where you either preserve your soul or sell it for temporary relief. One more message to the unreliable person. One more compromise against your instinct. One more habit that numbs the very truth trying to awaken. This is where betrayal reveals its final secret. It was never only about another person. It was about the divided kingdom within you. The false self had to crack so a more integral self could emerge. In that sense, betrayal is not the end of innocence. It is the end of illusion. And when the lesson is integrated, you do not become cold. You become accurate. You stop kneeling at altars that demand self-abandonment. That is the philosopher's stone in psychological form, not in vulnerability, but integrity. The wound remains part of your story, but it is no longer your prison. It becomes a door.